The village of St. Elmora lay nestled in a valley, embraced by rolling hills and thick forests that seemed untouched by time. It was a place that felt like it had slipped out of the pages of history, with its cobblestone streets, weathered stone cottages, and winding paths shaded by old oaks and chestnuts. The heart of the village was the Church of St. Albinus, a centuries-old structure with walls of gray stone, its facade carved with intricate depictions of saints and biblical scenes. The church's bell tower, though modest in height, was a beacon for miles, its chimes echoing across the valley and marking the passage of time for the villagers. St. Albinus was renowned for its statue of Christ, a life-sized figure carved in wood, mounted on a weathered cross that had stood in place for as long as anyone could remember. The statue was revered by the villagers, a symbol of faith and endurance, its serene face a reminder of sacrifice and love. Pilgrims occasionally made their way to St. Elmora just to gaze upon the statue, believing it held a quiet power, a palpable sense of the divine. Father Aidan, the local priest, had served at St. Albinus for over 2 decades. He was a tall, lean man with thinning hair and kind eyes that carried the weight of many unspoken thoughts. Though known for his devotion, Aidan was also a man who grappled with the complexities of faith. His prayers were often whispered questions rather than declarations of certainty. He believed deeply, yet he doubted constantly, and it was this tension that drew the villagers to him, trusting that he understood their own struggles with belief. On this particular morning, the air was crisp with the scent of rain that had fallen overnight. Father Aidan awoke before dawn, as was his custom, and made his way to the church in the pre-dawn light. The sky was a deep blue, just beginning to soften at the edges with the promise of sunrise. Inside the church, the cool air greeted him, carrying the familiar mingling smells of incense, old wood, and the faint tang of candle wax. He lit the candles along the altar, their soft glow filling the darkened space, casting long shadows that danced across the stone walls. Today was no ordinary day. The Mass that Father Aidan was preparing for held special significance. It was a celebration Mass, meant to bring the community together and offer a sense of comfort during a time of uncertainty. The village, like many small communities, had faced hardships lately: poor harvests, economic struggles, and a creeping sense of unease that had settled over the valley like a low, lingering mist. The church, with its rituals and prayers, was a place where people sought solace, and Aidan felt the weight of his responsibility to bring them that comfort. As the morning sun began to filter through the stained glass windows, casting vibrant patterns of color on the stone floor, villagers slowly filled the pews. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, a kind of subdued excitement mixed with the unspoken fears they carried. Families arrived together, greeting each other with nods and quiet words. Children fidgeted in their Sunday best, while the elders took their seats with solemn expressions, clutching their rosaries as if they were lifelines. Father Aidan watched them file in, recognizing familiar faces. Mrs. Davenport, the widow who always sat in the front row, her eyes perpetually downcast. The Miller family, who had recently lost their youngest child to illness, their grief still raw and visible. There was a comfort in these familiar faces, even as he felt the heavy expectation they placed on him. He adjusted his vestments and took a deep breath, silently praying for the right words. The Mass began with the usual rituals, hymns sung by the congregation, their voices echoing in the vaulted space, the sound both haunting and beautiful. The choir sang in Latin, the ancient language adding a sense of timelessness to the service. Father Aidan led the prayers, his voice strong but tinged with an underlying vulnerability that only those who knew him well might detect. As he stood at the pulpit, preparing to deliver his sermon, he felt a shiver run down his spine, not of cold, but of an unplaceable unease. It was then that a strange chill swept through the church, a cold breeze that seemed out of place in the warmth of the sunlit morning. It rustled the pages of the open hymnal on the altar and flickered the flames of the candles. The congregation stirred, some looking around in confusion. Father Aidan hesitated, feeling the cold air against his face, wondering if it was simply his own nerves or something more. He cleared his throat and continued, speaking about hope and resilience, about finding strength in faith even when answers seemed elusive. But the unease only grew. He could see it in the faces of the villagers as they shifted in their seats, glancing nervously at the statue of Christ that loomed above the altar. The statue was positioned high, its head tilted slightly downward, as if watching over the congregation with a serene, almost sorrowful expression. It had always been a source of comfort, yet today it seemed different, darker somehow. It might have been a trick of the light, but the wooden face looked almost stern, its eyes deeper, more hollow. A murmur began to ripple through the pews, low and hesitant, like the first drops of rain before a storm. At first it was just a few whispers, then it spread. People pointed, their eyes wide with fear, and Father Aidan turned to see what had caused the disturbance. He felt his heart skip a beat. The statue's arm, once firmly nailed to the cross, seemed to be shifting. It was slight, barely noticeable, but unmistakable. The sound of creaking wood filled the silence, a soft but sharp noise that seemed to echo through the church. For a moment, everything froze. Father Aidan stood, rooted to the spot, his mind racing. Was this a sign, a miracle, or simply an accident, a trick of his own overworked imagination? He opened his mouth to speak, to reassure the crowd, but no words came. The creaking continued, louder now, and the nails that had held the statue's limbs in place for centuries began to bend and loosen. The statue moved again, more pronounced this time, as if it were pulling itself free. The silence broke. Someone screamed, a high-pitched, panicked cry that shattered the stillness. It was followed by gasps, shouts, and the sudden rush of bodies as people leapt from their seats, pushing and shoving their way to the exit. The sound of feet pounding on the stone floor filled the air, mingling with the shrill cries of children and the frantic shouts of parents trying to gather their families. The church, moments ago a place of prayer and solace, had become a scene of chaos. Father Aidan could only watch, frozen in shock, as the crowd fled. He glanced up at the statue once more. It was no longer shifting, but its new position was unmistakable. The arms had moved slightly away from the cross, and the head was tilted at a different angle, as if the carved figure of Christ were looking directly at him. Aidan felt a wave of nausea, his mind a whirlwind of disbelief and fear. He didn't know if he had witnessed a miracle or a disaster. The only thing he knew for certain was that nothing would ever be the same in St. Elmora. The village of St. Elmora was a place where news traveled quickly. By the time the last of the terrified congregation had fled the church, the story had already spread like wildfire. Children ran through the streets breathlessly recounting the moving statue to their friends. The elderly whispered fervently to one another as they leaned on their canes, recalling tales of miracles and omens from their own childhoods. In every home and on every corner, the villagers debated what they had seen. Some spoke in hushed tones, fearful that even discussing it might invoke something supernatural. Others argued loudly, dismissing it all as a coincidence or a result of poor maintenance. But the fact remained, everyone had seen it. Clara was among the first to gather her thoughts and make sense of what had happened. Clara was a young woman, not yet 25, but she had become something of a spiritual figure in the village despite her youth. Her deep, unwavering faith and her gentle, kind-hearted nature had earned her the respect of even the most hardened skeptics. She lived with her grandmother on the edge of the village, in a small cottage surrounded by wildflowers and herbs. That morning, after the incident, she sat at the wooden table in their kitchen, clutching her grandmother's rosary. The beads were warm in her hands, a comfort in the midst of the turmoil. Her grandmother, a stooped woman with sharp eyes that seemed to see straight into the soul, had listened carefully as Clara described what she had witnessed. "It's a sign," Clara whispered, her voice trembling but filled with conviction. "A sign from God, calling us to wake up, to open our hearts." Her grandmother said nothing, only nodding slowly as if she had expected something like this for a long time. Clara's resolve hardened. She knew she couldn't stay silent. The villagers needed her. They needed a voice of faith and hope in this moment of fear and confusion. By midday, Clara had made her way to the village square. It was a humble space, surrounded by small shops and houses with red-tiled roofs. A fountain sat at the center, its water sparkling in the sunlight. Normally, the square would be bustling with the sounds of children playing and merchants selling their goods. But today, it was different. People stood in groups, talking in low, urgent voices. When Clara appeared, many turned to look at her, sensing that she had something important to say. Clara climbed onto the edge of the fountain, her pale blue dress fluttering in the breeze, and raised her hands for silence. It took a moment, but the crowd quieted, their attention drawn to her calm and serene expression. "My friends," she began, her voice clear and strong. "I know that what we saw this morning has frightened many of us, but I believe that what happened was not a curse or an accident. It was a message from God, a call for us to awaken spiritually." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, mixed with a few skeptical grumbles. Clara continued, her face glowing with an inner light. "For too long, we have lived in fear, losing our way. This village has faced hardship and our faith has been tested. But today, I believe we have been given a sign. It is not a moment for panic, but for prayer and reflection." She bowed her head and began to pray aloud, inviting the villagers to join her. One by one, they did, clasping their hands and lowering their heads, the tension of the morning slowly giving way to a fragile sense of hope. Meanwhile, Bishop Raphael was already on his way to St. Elmora. Word of the incident had reached the diocesan office with alarming speed, and the bishop, known for his pragmatic and no-nonsense approach, had decided to investigate personally. Bishop Raphael was a man of few words, with a stern face that rarely broke into a smile. He was respected, if not loved, by the clergy under his charge. He was a staunch defender of the Church's doctrine, wary of anything that might lead the faithful toward superstition or unapproved forms of worship. When he arrived at the church, he found it empty, save for Father Aidan, who stood near the altar, staring up at the statue with a mixture of awe and confusion. The bishop's footsteps echoed loudly in the silence, and Aidan turned to face him, visibly startled. "Your Excellency," Aidan said, his voice strained. "I didn't expect you so soon." "I came as quickly as I could," Raphael replied curtly, his eyes already fixed on the statue. "Tell me exactly what happened." Aidan recounted the events in a halting voice, struggling to find the right words. He explained the breeze, the creaking of the wood, and the way the statue seemed to move of its own accord. The bishop listened in stony silence, his expression unreadable. When Aidan finished, Raphael shook his head. "There must be a rational explanation for this," he said firmly. "The statue is old. The nails are worn. It's no surprise that it might shift, especially if it hasn't been properly maintained." Aidan wanted to argue, to tell the bishop about the way the statue had looked at him, the feeling he'd had that it was more than just an accident. But he hesitated, knowing that Raphael would not accept anything he couldn't see or prove. Raphael's skepticism was evident as he summoned Thomas, a local engineer who often helped with repairs around the church. Thomas was a stout, middle-aged man with a graying beard and a face etched with lines from years of hard work. He brought his tools and set about examining the statue, inspecting the joints, the nails, and the wooden structure with meticulous care. After a thorough inspection, he reported back to the bishop and Aidan. "There's nothing structurally wrong," Thomas said, scratching his head. "The wood is old, yes, but it's solid. The nails were bent, but they hadn't rusted through. It's strange. I can't find any reason why it would have moved like that." Raphael's face darkened. He didn't like the ambiguity, the lack of a concrete explanation. "Perhaps you missed something," he snapped. "Check again. We cannot afford to have this kind of spectacle. It will only feed into the villagers' superstitions." Aidan watched the exchange in silence, feeling a deepening sense of unease. He couldn't shake the feeling that something profound had happened, something beyond their understanding. As the engineer continued his examination, Aidan slipped away, heading toward the church's small archive room. It was a dusty, cramped space filled with old manuscripts and records, many of which hadn't been touched in years. He began to sift through the shelves, pulling down books and parchment scrolls, his fingers growing grimy with dust. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for, only that he needed answers. After hours of searching, his eyes fell upon a thin, leather-bound book, its cover worn and cracked. It was a manuscript by Brother Matthias, a priest who had served at St. Albinus centuries ago. Aidan opened it carefully, the pages brittle with age. As he read, his breath caught in his throat. The manuscript detailed an event eerily similar to what had just happened: a statue of Christ, moving inexplicably during a time of great turmoil in the village. Brother Matthias had described it as a divine sign, a call for the people to turn back to their faith. The parallels were striking, too close to be a mere coincidence. Aidan sat back, the manuscript resting on his lap. His mind was a swirl of thoughts and emotions. Could it be true? Could they really be witnessing a miracle? A message from God? He knew what Raphael would say, that it was mere folklore, an old story twisted by time. But in his heart, Aidan felt something different, a flicker of belief that he hadn't felt in years. He knew he had to tread carefully, but he also knew he couldn't ignore what he had discovered. As the sun set over the village, casting long shadows over the cobblestones, Aidan made his way back to the main hall of the church, clutching the manuscript tightly. He had a decision to make, whether to stay silent, as Raphael would undoubtedly prefer, or to share what he had found with the villagers, giving voice to the possibility of a miracle. Father Aidan's fingers traced the faded ink on the brittle pages of Brother Matthias's manuscript, as if touching the words would help him understand the deeper meaning behind them. He sat alone in the small room, surrounded by shelves of ancient texts that seemed to hum with the weight of centuries. The flickering light of a single candle cast long shadows across the parchment, making the script dance as if it were alive, breathing with the secrets of the past. Matthias had written of a time of great unrest, a period when the village had been torn apart by conflict and famine. The priest had described a night when the statue of Christ had seemingly moved, its head turning towards the people as if in sorrow. It had been seen as a divine warning, a plea for the villagers to turn away from their disputes and find unity in their shared faith. Aidan's heart pounded as he read the final passages. Matthias had concluded that the miracle was not a sign of wrath, but of compassion, a call to repentance and reconciliation. He closed the manuscript slowly, feeling a profound sense of connection with the long-dead priest. Was he, like Matthias, being asked to shepherd his flock through a time of spiritual trial? The question filled him with both dread and a strange sense of purpose. He knew now what he had to do, even if it meant standing against the authority of Bishop Raphael. He could not dismiss what he had seen and what the manuscript seemed to confirm. He needed to share this with the villagers. They deserved to know that they were not alone in their confusion, that their fears and hopes were part of a larger divine story. The following day, the village square was once again filled with people. This time, there was less of the frantic energy that had characterized the previous gathering. Instead, there was a heavy, anticipatory silence. Clara stood at the center of the square, her eyes closed in silent prayer, her hands clasped together. The morning sun bathed her in golden light, giving her a halo-like glow. Many of the villagers had come at her urging. Word had spread that she had something important to say, and the people had gathered, seeking answers and comfort. When Clara finally opened her eyes, she looked around at the crowd, her gaze steady and filled with a quiet strength. "I know you're all afraid," she began, her voice gentle but carrying through the stillness. "And I understand why. What happened yesterday was unlike anything we've ever seen. But I ask you now, do not let fear cloud your hearts. I believe what we witnessed was a sign, a miracle, calling us to turn back to our faith." There were murmurs of agreement, but also some dissenting voices. A man from the back shouted, "How can you be so sure? It could just be a trick or a mistake." Clara did not flinch. She stepped down from the fountain and moved closer to the people, meeting their eyes with a calm smile. "I do not ask you to believe blindly," she said, "but I ask you to listen to your hearts. What do you feel? What do you sense when you remember that moment?" For many, the memory brought a shiver, a feeling that had been hard to place, something deep and unsettling but also profound. The villagers exchanged looks, some nodding slowly, others clutching their rosaries as if seeking reassurance. Clara's words seemed to weave a spell, drawing them together in a shared experience, a collective breath held in anticipation of what might come next. At the same time, Bishop Raphael stood at the doorway of the church, watching the scene unfold with a stern expression. He had already heard from Father Aidan about the manuscript and the supposed parallels with the past. He had dismissed it outright. Folklore, he had called it, stories meant to manipulate the gullible. But now, as he watched Clara speak and the crowd hang on her every word, a flicker of unease crossed his face. He could sense a shift happening in the village, a momentum building that was beyond his control. He knew he had to act quickly if he was to reassert the church's authority. Raphael stepped forward, cutting through the crowd like a knife. The villagers parted for him, sensing the tension that clung to him like a dark cloud. He was dressed in his formal robes, a stark contrast to the humble clothes of the villagers, and his eyes flashed with a sharp, almost angry light. "Enough," he barked, his voice ringing out across the square. "This is madness. You are being led astray by superstition and fear. There is no miracle here, only confusion. You must not allow yourselves to be deceived by false signs." The crowd fell silent, the atmosphere suddenly taut with a new kind of tension. Clara stood her ground, meeting the bishop's gaze without flinching. "And what if it is a sign?" she asked quietly, her voice like a ripple on still water. "What if this is God's way of speaking to us, of calling us back to faith?" Raphael's face twisted into a scowl. "You speak of faith," he snapped. "But what you are spreading is not faith. It is hysteria. You are leading these people into chaos, Clara." Clara's calm expression did not falter. "I am leading them into prayer," she replied. "I am asking them to seek the truth in their own hearts. Is that so wrong?" For a moment, the two stood there, locked in a silent battle of wills, the young woman with the soft voice and the bishop with the hardened gaze. The crowd watched, caught between the two figures like a flock of sheep torn between two shepherds. Father Aidan, who had been standing off to the side, finally stepped forward. He could feel the tension mounting, the invisible line being drawn in the sand. He knew that if he didn't speak now, the village might be irrevocably divided. "Your Excellency," he said, addressing Raphael, "I have read the manuscript of Brother Matthias. It describes an event just like this centuries ago. He believed it was a message from God, a call for unity and repentance. Perhaps we should consider the possibility that history is repeating itself." Raphael turned on him, his expression darkening even further. "You speak nonsense, Aidan. Ancient tales do not dictate our faith. The church dictates our faith. We must be the voice of reason here, not feed into these fantasies." Aidan took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his words before he spoke them. "Perhaps faith is not always about reason, Your Excellency. Perhaps it is also about mystery, about accepting what we cannot fully explain." His voice softened as he turned to the crowd. "I do not know what we witnessed yesterday, but I do know this. It has brought us together in a way I have not seen in years. Maybe that is the true miracle." There was a murmur of agreement from the crowd, a low, rising sound like the first gust of wind before a storm. Raphael looked around, his face contorting with frustration. He opened his mouth to respond, but Clara stepped in front of him, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "Please," she said quietly, "let us pray together, as a community. If it is truly God's will, then He will guide us. But we must listen, not just to the words of men, but to the voice of our own hearts." Raphael hesitated, his eyes flicking from Clara to Aidan, and then to the villagers who watched him with a mixture of fear and hope. He saw the change that had come over them, their eyes brighter, their faces softer, as if the simple act of coming together had lifted a great burden from their souls. For a moment, he felt a pang of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Doubt. He, the bishop, the defender of doctrine, was beginning to doubt his own convictions. With a sharp intake of breath, Raphael turned on his heel and walked away, disappearing into the shadow of the church's stone doorway. The crowd remained silent for a few moments, as if holding its collective breath. Then Clara bowed her head and began to pray aloud. One by one, the villagers joined in, their voices rising together in a hymn of unity and hope. Father Aidan stood beside her, his own voice mingling with theirs, feeling the tremble of his own uncertainty give way to a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, that uncertainty felt like a gift rather than a curse. He had no answers, but he had faith, and maybe, he realized, that was enough. The village square slowly emptied after the prayer, the sun dipping behind the hills, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the cobblestones. The air was filled with a quiet murmur of voices as families dispersed, speaking softly of the day's events. Clara lingered at the fountain, staring into the rippling water, her reflection distorted, but strangely serene. Her heart felt light, as if the burden she had carried since that fateful morning had finally been lifted. She had spoken her truth, shared her belief, and the villagers had listened. Whether or not they believed was another matter, but they had heard her, and that was enough for now. Father Aidan approached her slowly, his expression one of deep contemplation. He had watched her speak with a kind of awe, recognizing a strength in her that he had rarely seen, even in his years of service. She was young, but her faith was pure, untainted by the doubts that plagued him. "You did well today," he said softly, standing beside her and gazing into the fountain. The water reflected the last light of the setting sun, shimmering like liquid gold. Clara turned to him with a gentle smile. "I only spoke what I felt in my heart," she replied. "I don't know if it's enough, but it's all I have." Aidan nodded slowly, his thoughts drifting back to the manuscript and the words of Brother Matthias. He felt the weight of centuries pressing down on him, the sense that they were not the first to stand at this crossroads between faith and reason. "Sometimes," he said, almost to himself, "all we have is our heart, and maybe that's enough." Bishop Raphael, however, was far from convinced. He sat in the dimly lit rectory, the heavy oak door closed tightly, shutting out the murmurs of the villagers still lingering outside. His hands were clasped tightly together, his knuckles white as if he were holding on to something unseen. He had retreated from the square not just in anger, but in fear. Fear that the events unfolding were slipping beyond his control. He had spent his life upholding the church's teachings, grounding himself in doctrine and reason. And now, in the face of this inexplicable occurrence, he felt the foundation of his beliefs begin to tremble. He glanced up as the door creaked open, and Father Aidan stepped inside. The priest's face was shadowed, lit only by the flickering candlelight. A tense silence filled the room as they regarded each other, two men on opposite sides of an invisible line that had been drawn between them. "You've read the manuscript," Raphael said finally, his voice low and rough, like stones grinding together. It wasn't a question, but a statement heavy with accusation. "I have," Aidan admitted. He moved closer, standing before the bishop with a calmness he hadn't felt earlier. "And I believe it's relevant. Brother Matthias wrote of a similar event, a time when the statue moved and it was seen as a divine sign." Raphael scoffed, the sound sharp and dismissive. "Old stories, Aidan. Myths meant to comfort the ignorant. You cannot seriously believe that what happened here is anything but coincidence or, at most, a failure of the structure." Aidan's eyes flashed with a rare intensity. "And what if it's not?" he challenged. "What if this is something beyond our understanding, something we're meant to embrace, not explain away?" Raphael rose to his feet, towering over Aidan, his expression one of barely controlled fury. "You are a priest," he hissed. "Your duty is to uphold the teachings of the church, not indulge in fantasies and lead these people astray." Aidan held his ground, refusing to be intimidated. "My duty is to guide them in their faith. he said quietly. And faith isn't always about what we can prove. It's about what we feel, what we believe in our hearts, even when reason fails us. The bishop stared at him for a long moment, his face a mask of anger and frustration. Then he turned away, waving a hand as if to dismiss the entire conversation. "You are treading dangerous ground, Aiden," he warned. "Be careful where this path leads you." As the days passed, the tension in the village only grew. The event at the church had divided the community. Some, led by Clara, believed wholeheartedly that they had witnessed a miracle. They began gathering regularly in the village square, holding prayer meetings and sharing stories of small signs they claimed to have seen. An inexplicable light in the sky, a sudden warmth in the air despite the cold autumn wind. These gatherings became a source of comfort for many, a way to make sense of the uncertainty that had settled over St. Elmora like a thick fog. Others, however, sided with Bishop Raphael. They saw the incident as a disturbing anomaly, a trick of the old wood, perhaps, or the result of neglect. They grumbled about the danger of encouraging superstition, worrying that the village was slipping into fanaticism. They pointed to the bishop's stern warnings, insisting that the church needed to take a firmer hand in quelling these irrational beliefs before they spiraled out of control. Father Aiden found himself caught in the middle, torn between his loyalty to the church and his empathy for the villagers. He continued to serve at the church, delivering his sermons and leading the prayers, but his words had changed. He spoke less of certainty and more of mystery, encouraging the congregation to embrace the unknown and to find strength in their shared journey of faith, even if it meant admitting their doubts. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a deep red glow across the sky, Aiden walked alone to the edge of the village, where the old chapel ruins stood. It was a place he often came to when he needed to think, a quiet sanctuary away from the eyes and expectations of the villagers. He sat on a crumbling stone wall, looking out over the valley as the first stars began to prick the darkening sky. He was not alone for long. Clara soon appeared, as if she had known he would be there. She sat beside him in silence for a while, both of them watching the last light fade from the sky. "You've been different lately," Clara said finally, her voice soft, almost hesitant. "I can see it in your eyes. You're not the same man who stood at the pulpit a month ago." Aiden turned to look at her, searching her face for any hint of judgment, but there was none. Only understanding and a kind of quiet sadness. "I feel like I've been living two lives," he admitted. "The life of a priest who knows what he's supposed to say, and the life of a man who is filled with questions he can't answer." Clara nodded slowly, her eyes reflecting the starlight. "Maybe that's what faith really is," she said. "Not having all the answers, but being willing to search for them, even if you never find them." They sat together in the deepening night, the silence between them filled with the unspoken bond of two souls, wrestling with the same uncertainty. For the first time in weeks, Aiden felt a sense of peace settle over him, as if he had been given permission to let go of his need for certainty and simply be present in the moment, embracing the mystery of it all. The next Sunday, the church was filled to capacity, the pews packed with villagers who had come to hear what Father Aiden would say. The tension was palpable, the air thick with anticipation. Aiden stood at the pulpit, his hands gripping the edge of the wood, feeling the familiar roughness beneath his fingers. He took a deep breath and began to speak, not from his prepared notes, but from his heart. He spoke of his own doubts, his own journey through fear and confusion. He admitted that he did not have all the answers, that he could not say for certain whether what they had witnessed was a miracle or a mere accident. But he urged the congregation to look beyond the need for explanations and to find unity in their shared experience. "We may never know for sure what happened," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "But we do know this. It brought us together. It reminded us of the power of faith, of the comfort we find in one another. And maybe that is the true miracle." The villagers listened in rapt silence, some with tears streaming down their faces. When he finished, there was no applause, only a deep collective sigh, as if a great weight had been lifted from their hearts. Aidan stepped down from the pulpit, feeling a calm he had not known in years. He knew now that his role was not to provide all the answers, but to guide his people through their own journey of faith, to help them find peace in the mysteries they could not solve. In the weeks that followed, the village began to heal. Bishop Raphael, though still skeptical, softened his stance, acknowledging that the people had found comfort in their newfound unity. He and Aidan never fully agreed on what had happened, but there was a mutual respect that grew between them, an understanding that there were things beyond their control, beyond even their understanding. Clara continued her prayer gatherings, now joined by Aidan, who no longer led them as a priest, but participated as a fellow seeker of truth. The statue of Christ remained in its new position, untouched and unchanged, a silent witness to the transformation that had taken place in the village. The villagers no longer looked at it with fear, but with a quiet reverence, seeing it not as a sign of warning, but as a symbol of the deeper mysteries of faith, mysteries that they had learned to embrace together. And so, life in St. Elmora slowly returned to its quiet rhythm, the church bells ringing out once more, not as a call to fear, but as a reminder of the enduring power of faith and community.